The candle nearest the door went out just as Eleanor Whitmore heard her own name spoken in a tone that made her stomach turn cold. She froze behind the tall curtain at the edge of the ballroom, one hand pressed flat against the silk, and listened as two ladies laughed about the companion girl who had dared to look up when the Duke walked past. She did not move. She had learned long ago that the safest place for a woman without fortune was the shadow, not the light, and tonight the light belonged entirely to Julian Ashcombe, the Duke of Ashcombe, who had returned to London after 3 years away and had every unmarried woman in the city rearranging her whole season around him. Eleanor was not one of them. She was 24 years old, paid a modest wage to walk 2 steps behind Lady Constance Fairclough, fetch her shawls, remember her appointments, and disappear the moment a gentleman approached. She had accepted this role the way she accepted rain in April, without complaint, because complaint changed nothing. But tonight something had already gone wrong. Lady Constance had sent her to retrieve a fan from the card room, and Eleanor had taken the long way through the terrace to avoid the crush of guests near the punch table. She had not expected to find the Duke standing there alone, one hand resting on the stone railing, looking out at the garden as though the party inside bored him more than the dark did. She stopped so quickly that her heel caught on the hem of her dress. He turned before she could retreat. "You are the only person in this house tonight who did not want to be seen," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only something close to relief. Eleanor did not know how to answer a duke who spoke to her as though she were simply a person and not a title to be won, or a name to be whispered about. She said the first true thing she could think of. "I was sent for a fan, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude." "You have not intruded. You have interrupted an evening I did not want to attend, and for that I am grateful." She should have curtsied and left. Instead, she found herself studying him, the way his shoulders sat too stiff for a man who was supposedly the most desired guest in London, the way his eyes kept drifting back toward the ballroom doors as if counting the minutes until he could escape. "You do not enjoy being admired," she said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression, surprise first, then a flicker of something warmer. "No one has said that to me directly in 3 years." "Then perhaps no one has looked at you directly in 3 years, Your Grace, only at your title." The words left her mouth and she felt the danger of them immediately. A companion did not speak to a duke this way. A companion did not speak to a duke at all unless spoken to first, and even then only in the smallest, safest sentences. But he laughed. A short, surprised sound, and the tightness in his shoulders eased just slightly. "What is your name?" "Eleanor Whitmore, Your Grace, companion to Lady Constance Fairclough." "Eleanor Whitmore," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "I intend to remember that." She did not believe him. Men like him remembered ballrooms full of silk and jewels, not a companion sent to fetch a fan. She excused herself before the conversation could go further, walked back inside with her heart beating too fast, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing. It meant nothing the following week either, or so she insisted to herself, when the Duke appeared at Lady Fairclough's own gathering and, upon entering the room, found Eleanor's eyes across the crowd before he found anyone else's. Lady Constance noticed. Lady Constance noticed everything that might affect her own prospects, and the Duke of Ashcombe was the single greatest prospect currently walking through London society. She pulled Eleanor aside near the refreshment table, her smile tight and pleasant for anyone watching, her voice low and sharp for Eleanor alone. "The Duke looked at you twice before he looked at me once," she said. "I trust that was accidental." "Entirely accidental, my lady. I have done nothing to invite his attention." "See that you continue to do nothing." Lady Constance's fingers closed briefly around Eleanor's wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make the warning plain. "A man like that does not choose a companion. He chooses a wife with land and a name worth attaching to his own. Do not embarrass yourself by forgetting what you are." Eleanor did not forget. She could not afford to. Her father had died with debts instead of an inheritance, and her mother had followed him 2 winters later, leaving Eleanor with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a letter of recommendation that had, by luck alone, found its way to Lady Constance's household. She understood precisely what she was. A servant with better manners than most, tolerated because she was useful, and dismissed the instant she became inconvenient. So when the Duke crossed the room toward her not 10 minutes later, ignoring 3 separate ladies who angled themselves directly into his path, Eleanor felt something close to panic. "Your Grace," she said quickly, before he could speak, "I do not believe we should continue any acquaintance. It would not be proper." "Proper for whom?" "For me. I have a position to protect, and Lady Constance has already made her feelings known on the matter." He studied her for a long moment, and she watched him decide something, though she could not guess what. Then I will not seek you out at gatherings where it might cause you trouble. But I would like to know more of the woman who told a duke the truth about himself within 5 minutes of meeting him. There is little to know, Your Grace. I am not interesting. You are the only person tonight I have wanted to speak with twice. She left the conversation shaken, not because he had said anything improper, but because he had said something true. And truth from a man in his position was more dangerous than any flattery could ever be. Flattery she could dismiss. Truth she found herself turning over in her mind long after the carriage had carried her and Lady Constance home through the dark London streets. Over the following 2 weeks, Eleanor told herself the acquaintance had ended as quietly as it began. She busied herself with Lady Constance's correspondence, her fittings, her endless string of social obligations, and she did not attend the gatherings where the Duke was known to appear, choosing instead to remain behind with whatever task Lady Constance assigned her. It did not matter. He found reasons. He called upon Lady Constance's household directly, ostensibly to discuss a shared acquaintance from his years abroad, and stayed only long enough to catch Eleanor's eye across the drawing room before excusing himself. He sent no letters, made no improper requests, did nothing that could be reported to anyone as scandal. But Eleanor began to understand that the Duke of Ashcombe, who had ignored the calculated efforts of London's most eligible women for 3 straight weeks, had decided, without asking her permission, that he intended to know her. And she began to understand something far more frightening. She did not want him to stop. That fear followed her into her narrow bedroom at the top of the Faircliff townhouse, where she sat by candlelight, and reminded herself, sentence by sentence, of every reason this could only end badly. A duke did not marry a companion. A duke's family would never allow it. And even if some miracle bent the rules of the world enough to make it possible, society would tear her apart for the audacity of rising above her station. She thought of Lady Constance's warning, of the debts her father had left behind, of the letter of recommendation that was the only thing standing between her and complete ruin. She thought of how easily a woman like her could be discarded, how quickly a reputation could be destroyed by nothing more than a rumor. And still, when she closed her eyes that night, she saw him standing on the terrace, asking her name as though it mattered, as though she mattered, in a world that had spent her whole life insisting she did not. 3 streets away, in a study lined with books he rarely had time to read, Julian Ashcombe sat with a glass of wine he had not touched and turned over the same conversation in his mind. His mother had already begun compiling a list of suitable brides, women with the right bloodlines and the right fortunes, women who would strengthen the family name the way a duke was expected to. He had looked at every name on that list and felt nothing. He had spoken to Eleanor Whitmore for perhaps 10 minutes total, across 2 separate evenings, and he felt more than he had felt in 3 years of careful, dutiful courtship attempts arranged by people who had never once asked what he actually wanted. He did not yet know what he intended to do about that. He only knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that he was not finished seeking her out, no matter what Lady Constance Faircliff or the whole of London society might have to say about it. His closest friend, Edmund Carow, found him in that same study the following morning, still turning the matter over as though it were a puzzle with no clean solution. Edmund had known him since their school days, long before either of them held any title worth mentioning, and he was the only man in London who spoke to Julian without measuring every word for advantage. "You have the look of a man who has made a decision he has not yet admitted to himself," Edmund said, dropping into the chair across from him, without waiting for an invitation. "I have made no decision." "Then you have the look of a man about to make one. I saw you at the Faircliff house. You barely spoke 10 words to our host and 20 to her companion." Julian did not deny it. There was little use denying anything to Edmund, who had a way of noticing exactly what a person wished to hide. "She is unlike anyone I have met since I returned. She is also a companion with no fortune, no family name, and no protection if this goes wrong. Your mother has already chosen 3 ladies she considers suitable. If you pursue this, you will bring trouble to a woman who has no means of weathering it." The warning was not unkind, only honest, and Julian felt the weight of it settle over him. Edmund was right. Whatever he wanted, whatever he felt when Eleanor Whitmore looked at him as though his title meant nothing at all, the world they lived in did not forgive a duke for choosing a companion over a lady of standing. It certainly would not forgive her. "I do not intend to bring her any trouble," Julian said quietly. "I only intend to know her." "Those 2 things are not always as separate as you believe," Edmund replied, and left him with that thought hanging in the quiet room, unresolved, the way most difficult truths tended to remain. Across London, in the narrow room above the Faircliff kitchens, Eleanor woke before dawn from a habit she had never managed to break, and lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house stirring to life around her. She thought, as she often did in these early hours, of her mother's voice, gentle and practical, telling her once that a woman without fortune survived by being useful and invisible in equal measure. She had followed that advice faithfully for 6 years. She intended to go on following it, but for the first time since her parents had died and left her with nothing but debts and a trunk of clothes too fine for her current position, she found herself wishing, just once, that the world allowed her to be seen. The letter arrived without warning, tucked inside a book Lady Constance had ordered from a shop near Bond Street, and Eleanor's hands trembled the moment she recognized the seal pressed into the wax. She should not have opened it. She should have carried it directly to Lady Constance, since the book had been addressed to the household and not to her personally. Instead, she stood alone in the small library, broke the seal with fingers that did not feel entirely steady, and read the single line written in a firm, unhurried hand. I have not stopped thinking of the woman who told me the truth on a terrace. Meet me in the garden behind the Hollingsworth townhouse tomorrow at 4, if you are willing. If not, I will trouble you no further. J.A. She read it 3 times before she folded it small enough to hide inside her sleeve, and she spent the rest of the day arguing with herself about what a sensible woman would do. A sensible woman would burn the letter and forget it existed. A sensible woman understood that a duke's interest in a companion could only end one of 2 ways, either in scandal that destroyed her completely, or in a quiet arrangement that stole her dignity while pretending to offer affection. She had heard enough stories from other companions and maids across London to know exactly how these things typically ended, and none of the endings were kind to the woman involved. And yet, when 4 o'clock arrived the following day, Eleanor found herself walking through the Hollingsworth garden gate, telling Lady Constance only that she needed air after a long morning of correspondence. Julian was already waiting near a row of rose bushes that had not yet bloomed, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carrying none of the practiced ease he wore at gatherings. He looked, Eleanor thought, like a man who had genuinely not been certain she would come. "You came," he said. "I should not have. And yet you did." She crossed her arms against the early spring chill, or perhaps against the nervousness that had followed her the entire walk over. "Your Grace, I must ask you plainly what you intend by this. I am not a woman of leisure who can afford scandal, nor am I a woman who understands the games your society plays. If this is a game to you, I would rather know now." "It is not a game." His voice sharpened slightly, not with anger but with the frustration of being misunderstood. "I have spent 3 years since returning to London, being introduced to women who recite the same rehearsed compliments, who laugh at the same rehearsed moments, who want nothing from me except the title attached to my name. You are the first person who has spoken to me as though I were simply a man standing in front of you." "Because you are simply a man standing in front of me," Eleanor said. "The rest of London seems to forget that fact rather easily." He almost smiled at that, and something in his shoulders eased the way it had on the terrace, weeks earlier. "Then perhaps that is precisely why I cannot stop thinking of you." They walked the length of the garden together, careful to keep enough distance between them that no passing servant could mistake the meeting for anything improper, though Eleanor suspected distance alone would not save either of them if anyone chose to gossip. She learned, in that half hour, that he had spent his years abroad managing his family's holdings in the West Indies, that he had lost his father young and inherited responsibilities he had never wanted, at an age when most young men were still at university, that he found London society exhausting in ways he had never been permitted to admit aloud. She told him little in return, only small, safe truths, the names of the books she preferred, the fact that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher before her circumstances made that dream impossible. She did not tell him about her father's debts or her mother's final illness, or the fear that lived permanently in the back of her mind, the fear of being cast out with nowhere to go. When the half hour ended, he asked to see her again, and she said yes before she had fully decided to. Over the following fortnight, their meetings became a careful, secretive rhythm. A quarter hour in a garden, a brief exchange at a shared acquaintances gathering, conducted with enough formality that no one watching could suspect anything beyond polite courtesy. A note passed through a trusted servant, brief and careful, never containing anything that could be used against either of them if discovered. Eleanor told herself repeatedly that this was harmless, that 2 people speaking honestly with one another broke no rule that truly mattered, even if it broke every rule society had constructed around rank and station. She almost believed it, until the morning Lady Constance summoned her to the drawing room with an expression Eleanor had never seen on her employer's face before, cold in a way that promised real danger. "I have heard something troubling," Lady Constance said, not inviting Eleanor to sit. "A rumor, though I am certain it cannot be true, that the Duke of Ashcombe has been seen speaking privately with my companion on more than one occasion." Eleanor kept her expression carefully still, though her heart had begun pounding hard enough that she feared Lady Constance might hear it. "I cannot speak to rumors, my lady. I have exchanged pleasantries with the Duke as any member of your household might, when he calls upon you. Do not insult my intelligence, Eleanor. I have eyes in every room I attend, and I am told the pleasantries have occurred rather more than one might expect from a Duke toward a companion he has no reason to notice." Lady Constance's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "I took you into my household out of charity, when your family's ruin left you with nothing. I gave you a position when few others would have bothered. I expect, in return, that you will not embarrass me by entangling yourself with a man so far above your station that the very idea invites ridicule." "I have no intention of embarrassing you, my lady. See that you do not, because if I hear of this again, I will have no choice but to release you from my service, and you will find, Eleanor, that letters of recommendation do not grow easily for companions dismissed under a cloud of scandal." The threat sat heavy in Eleanor's chest for the rest of the day. She understood precisely what Lady Constance meant. Without a position, without a reference, she would have nowhere to go and no way to support herself, and the small, precarious security she had built over 6 years of careful, invisible service would collapse entirely. That evening, she wrote to Julian for the first time, a short note delivered through the same trusted servant who had carried his messages to her. She did not soften the truth. "I cannot continue meeting you. My position depends on discretion I can no longer guarantee, and I have no fortune to fall back on if I lose it. Please do not think this reflects any lack of regard on my part. It reflects only the reality of what I am, and what you are, and how little those two things are permitted to meet in this world." She sent it before she could reconsider, and told herself firmly that this was the sensible ending to a foolish, dangerous distraction, the ending a careful woman chose before the danger chose it for her instead. Julian received the note in his study, read it twice, and felt something in his chest tighten in a way he had not expected. He understood the fear behind every word. He understood, too, that Eleanor was right about the danger, that his own position offered him protection hers could never match, that if this went wrong, she would bear the consequences while he suffered nothing more than a season's worth of gossip. But understanding the danger did not make him willing to simply let her go. He sat with the note for a long while before calling for his carriage, and when Edmund arrived that evening to find him already dressed to go out, his friend's expression turned wary. "Where are you going?" "To speak with her, once more, properly, so she understands I do not intend to disappear the moment this becomes difficult." "Julian." Edmund's voice carried real concern now, not just caution. "If Lady Constance has already threatened her position, your visit will only make things worse. You will be seen leaving her townhouse or seen calling on a companion directly, and the rumor will spread faster than either of you can control." Julian paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and for a moment the weight of everything Edmund had said settled over him fully. He thought of his mother's list of suitable brides, of the family name he was expected to protect above all else, of the quiet, careful life Eleanor had built for herself out of nothing, a life he now threatened simply by wanting her. He did not turn back that night, but he did send his carriage away, and instead walked the streets alone for nearly 2 hours, trying to find some path forward that did not require Eleanor to sacrifice everything, so that he might have what he wanted. He found no such path. Only the growing certainty that whatever happened next, he was not willing to let her walk away without a fight, no matter what it cost either of them. While Julian walked the empty streets turning the problem over, the ladies of the season had begun their own campaign, unaware that the man they pursued had already given his heart to someone else entirely. Lady Priscilla Thornberry, the wealthiest heiress in 3 counties, had taken to arriving early at every gathering she suspected the Duke might attend, positioning herself near the entrance so that his first sight upon entering would be her carefully arranged smile. Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth, whose garden Julian and Eleanor had walked through in secret, had sent no fewer than 4 invitations to private dinners in a single fortnight, each one more elaborate than the last. Neither woman understood why their efforts kept failing. Julian attended the gatherings out of obligation, spoke the necessary courtesies, and left as quickly as propriety allowed, his attention clearly elsewhere in a way that both frustrated and confused the women competing for it. Rumors began circulating among the mothers of the season, quiet speculation about whether the Duke had perhaps formed an attachment abroad, some foreign lady he had left behind and could not forget. None of them guessed the truth, that the woman occupying his every thought stood 2 steps behind Lady Constance Faircliffe at every gathering, fetching shawls and remembering appointments, invisible to everyone except the one man whose attention mattered least to the rules of the game she was supposed to be playing. Eleanor felt the tension of that unspoken truth every day. She watched Lady Priscilla and Lady Beatrice compete for a man who had already looked past them entirely, and she felt no triumph in it, only a deepening dread. Their attention was relentless and their resources vast, and if either woman ever suspected the real reason for the Duke's distraction, Eleanor understood exactly how quickly that suspicion could turn into cruelty aimed squarely at her. She confided none of this to anyone, not even the one maid in the Faircliff household she had come to trust over the years, a young woman named Charlotte who noticed Eleanor's distracted silences, but knew better than to press for answers she had not been offered freely. Eleanor carried the weight alone, the way she had carried every difficult thing in her life since her parents died, because that was the only way she had ever learned to survive. 2 days after she sent her note ending things with Julian, she received no reply, and she told herself that silence was for the best, that he had accepted her decision, and would move forward with the season as everyone expected him to. She almost believed it, until Charlotte found her in the linen room one afternoon, breathless from having hurried up the back stairs. "There is a gentleman asking for you at the servants' entrance," Charlotte whispered. "He gave no name, but Eleanor, he is dressed far too fine to be calling on any of us." Eleanor's hands went still over the linens she had been folding. She knew, without needing to ask, exactly who waited at that door, and she knew that his presence there, however discreet he believed himself to be, represented exactly the kind of risk she had written to him about only 2 nights earlier. She went anyway. He stood in the narrow alley behind the townhouse, out of sight of the main street, his fine coat looking entirely out of place against the soot-stained brick. When he saw her, something in his posture loosened, as though he had genuinely feared she would refuse to come at all. "You should not be here," she said immediately, glancing over her shoulder toward the kitchen door. "If anyone sees you, if anyone tells Lady Constance." "I received your letter," he said, cutting gently through her worry. "I understand every word of it. I understand the danger you would face, and I will not pretend that danger is not real. But I could not simply accept it and walk away without telling you, plainly, that I do not intend to forget you, because a letter asked me to. Your Grace, this cannot continue. You have a duty to your family, to your name, and I have nothing to offer that would ever be considered a suitable match for either." "I am not asking you to offer anything," he said. "I am asking for time. Time to find some way through this that does not require you to disappear from my life entirely, and does not require you to sacrifice the safety you have built for yourself. I do not yet know what that path looks like, but I am asking you to trust that I am looking for it." Eleanor wanted, more than she had wanted anything in a long time, to believe him, but 6 years of careful invisibility had taught her that trust was a luxury women in her position could rarely afford, and she stood in that alley, torn between the safety of her old caution and the dangerous, growing certainty that this man meant every word he said. "I cannot promise you anything," she finally said, "but I will not pretend I want you to stop looking either." It was not agreement, not exactly, but it was enough to send him back into the London night with something close to hope, and enough to leave Eleanor standing alone in the alley afterward, aware that whatever careful ending she had tried to write for herself, it had already slipped entirely out of her control. The knock came at midnight, sharp and urgent, and Eleanor woke with her heart already racing before she had even opened her eyes. Charlotte stood in the doorway of her small room, candle trembling in her hand, her face pale in the flickering light. "Lady Constance wants you in her study. Now." She looked ready to breathe fire, Eleanor. "I have never seen her like this." Eleanor dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons she could normally manage without thought, and followed Charlotte down the narrow servants' stairs into the main house. She had a terrible feeling she already knew what awaited her, though she prayed she was wrong. She was not wrong. Lady Constance stood in her study with a letter clutched in one hand, and the expression on her face was not simply anger, but something closer to triumph. The look of a woman who has finally caught someone in the exact wrongdoing she suspected all along. "Explain this," she said, thrusting the letter forward. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. It was one of the notes Julian had sent through the trusted servant, the one meant for her eyes alone, somehow intercepted before it ever reached her hands. She read enough of it to understand the danger, words that spoke plainly of affection, of a future he hoped to find some way toward, words that could never be mistaken for simple courtesy between a duke and a household servant. "My lady, I can explain. You will explain nothing, because there is nothing you could possibly say that would make this acceptable." Lady Constance's voice shook with barely restrained fury. "I warned you. I told you precisely what would happen if this rumor proved true, and now I hold proof in my own hand that you have been carrying on a secret correspondence with the Duke of Ashcombe behind my back, in my own household, under my own roof. It is not what it appears." It is exactly what it appears to be, and worse, because you have made a fool of me in the process. Do you understand what people will say if this becomes known? That my own companion stole the attention of the most eligible man in London, while I entertained him in my drawing room. I will be a laughingstock. Eleanor felt the room tilting slightly, the way it always did, when the ground she stood on turned out to be far less stable than she had believed. My lady, I never intended to embarrass you. I never sought his attention. I have tried, more than once, to end any acquaintance between us, precisely because I understood the danger it posed to my position here. And yet here we are, with proof in my hand, that you continued regardless. Lady Constance folded the letter with sharp, deliberate movements. You are dismissed from my service, effective immediately. I will provide no letter of recommendation, given the circumstances, and I expect you to have your belongings removed from this house by morning. The words landed like physical blows. Eleanor had known this was possible, had feared it every day since the first conversation on the terrace, but hearing it spoken aloud, final and absolute, felt entirely different from merely fearing it in the abstract. My lady, please, I have nowhere else to go. My family is gone. My only reference has been with you these 6 years. You should have considered that before you risked everything for a man who will marry a woman of proper standing within the year, regardless of whatever affection he claims to feel for you now. Men like the Duke of Ashcombe do not marry companions, Eleanor. They amuse themselves with them, and then they marry someone suitable, and the companion is left with nothing. I am simply ensuring you learn that lesson now, before it costs you more than a position in my household. Eleanor left the study with her hands shaking, walked back up the narrow stairs in a daze, and sat on the edge of her small bed staring at the trunk that held everything she owned in the world. Charlotte followed her up, quiet and frightened, and sat beside her without speaking for a long while. What will you do? Charlotte finally asked. I do not know. Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. I have no family left, no reference, no savings beyond what little I have managed to set aside these past 2 years. I have perhaps enough to secure a room for a fortnight, and after that, I truly do not know. You could send word to the Duke. Surely he would help. No. The word came out sharper than Eleanor intended, and she softened it immediately. No, Charlotte. If I go to him now, dismissed and desperate, it will look exactly as Lady Constance predicted, as though I sought him out for rescue, as though the affection between us was calculation rather than truth. And even if he helped me, what would that help look like? A house he pays for? A position he arranges? I would become precisely the kind of woman society already assumes I am, kept and dependent, with no dignity of my own remaining. She did not sleep that night. She spent the hours instead sorting through her small collection of belongings, deciding what she could carry and what she would need to leave behind, and turning over the same impossible question again and again, without finding any answer that did not terrify her. By morning, word of her dismissal had already begun spreading through the household staff, the way such things always did, and by midday, Eleanor suspected, it would reach further than the servants' quarters. Lady Constance was not a woman who suffered embarrassment quietly, and Eleanor understood that her former employer would likely ensure the story reached exactly the ears most damaging to her reputation, if only to prove to society that she herself bore no blame for the scandal. She was proven right within 2 days. The rumor spread through London's drawing rooms with astonishing speed, transformed and exaggerated with each retelling, until the truth barely resembled itself. By the time it reached Lady Priscilla Thornbury and Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth, the story had become something cruel and complete. A companion of no fortune who had schemed her way into a duke's affections, dismissed in disgrace when her employer discovered the deception. Eleanor learned of the rumor's full shape when she attempted to secure a position with a respectable family 2 streets over, a household in need of a governess for their 2 young daughters. The lady of that house had seemed genuinely pleased with Eleanor's qualifications, until she asked, almost as an afterthought, where Eleanor had previously served. Faircliff household, Eleanor answered honestly, and watched the woman's expression shift from warmth to careful distance within the space of a single breath. I see, the lady said. I am afraid the position has already been filled. Thank you for your time. It happened again the following day, and the day after that, each rejection more polite and more final than the last, until Eleanor understood with sickening clarity that no respectable household in London would hire a companion dismissed under a cloud of scandal involving a duke. Her name had become a cautionary tale whispered among the very families who might otherwise have employed her, and there was nothing she could say or do to unwrite the story now circulating without her permission. She had, by her own careful count, enough money remaining for perhaps 10 more days of the small room she had rented near Cheapside, A room with a thin mattress and a window that let in more cold than light. After that, she did not know what would become of her, and the not knowing sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. Julian, meanwhile, learned of Eleanor's dismissal through Edmund, who had heard the story from 3 separate acquaintances within a single afternoon, each version slightly more damaging than the one before. "You must do something," Edmund told him, finding Julian already pacing his study with an expression Edmund had rarely seen on his friend's face. Something close to desperation. "She has been dismissed without reference, and the rumor has already made her unemployable in any respectable household in this city." "I know. I have known for 2 hours, and I have thought of nothing else since." "Then what will you do?" Julian stopped pacing and looked at his friend directly. "I intend to find her, and I intend to help her, whatever the cost to my own reputation. I will not allow her to suffer alone for a situation I helped create. And if she refuses your help, you know her pride, Julian. You know how carefully she has guarded her independence. Then I will find another way. But I will not simply stand by while she suffers a ruin that is as much my doing as hers." He sent inquiries that same afternoon, discreet questions to the few contacts he trusted not to spread further gossip, hoping to locate where Eleanor had gone after her dismissal. It took 2 days to learn she had taken a room near Cheapside, and when he arrived there himself, dressed plainly and without his usual carriage to avoid drawing attention, he found the room empty, and the landlady unwilling to say where her former tenant had gone. "She left this morning," the landlady said, counting coins Eleanor had apparently paid in advance for a room she no longer occupied. "Paid through the week, but said she would not need it after all. Didn't say where she was headed, and I didn't ask. Not my business." Julian stood in that narrow, empty room for a long moment, the full weight of what had happened settling over him. Eleanor had disappeared, deliberately and completely, likely believing it was the only way to spare him further scandal and spare herself further humiliation. He did not yet know it, but she had already left London entirely, boarding a coach bound for a small village called Willowmere, where a distant cousin of her mother's kept a modest household, and had once, years earlier, offered Eleanor a place to stay should she ever need one. She had never expected to need it. She had certainly never expected to arrive with nothing but a trunk of belongings and a reputation she could not repair. As the coach carried her further from London, further from every connection she had ever known, Eleanor stared out at the passing countryside and told herself firmly that this was the right choice, the only choice, the choice that protected Julian from a scandal that would otherwise follow him for the rest of his life. She did not let herself consider what it would mean to never see him again. She could not afford to. Survival required looking forward, not backward, and looking backward now would only make the road ahead feel impossible to walk. But somewhere beneath the careful resolve she had built for herself, a small, stubborn part of her heart refused to fully believe this was truly the end. Even as the distance between London and Willowmere grew wider with every mile the coach carried her away. The coach reached Willowmere as the light faded into evening, and Eleanor stepped down onto a quiet lane lined with cottages far smaller and simpler than anything she had grown used to in London. Her mother's cousin, a widow named Margaret Holloway, met her at the door of a modest stone house with genuine warmth in her expression, though a trace of confusion lingered as she took in Eleanor's fine but travel-worn dress and the single trunk she carried. "You wrote so little in your letter," Margaret said, ushering her inside toward a small fire already lit against the evening chill. "Only that circumstances required you to leave London rather suddenly. I confess I am curious, though I will not press you until you are ready to speak of it." "Circumstances," Eleanor repeated quietly, settling into a worn chair near the hearth, "is a kind word for what actually happened. I lost my position. I lost my reputation along with it, through no true fault of my own, though I doubt the distinction matters much to anyone in London now." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then reached over and took Eleanor's cold hands in her own weathered ones. "Whatever happened, you are welcome here as long as you need. This is a small village, and word travels slowly from the city. You may find, if you are willing, that a fresh start is easier to build somewhere no one has already decided who you are." Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in days, to feel something close to relief. Willowmere was nothing like the London she had known. No grand ballrooms, no watchful society mothers, no danger lurking behind every polite conversation. Here, perhaps, she could simply be herself, ordinary and unremarkable, without the weight of a scandal following her into every room. She did not yet allow herself to hope for anything beyond that quiet safety. Hope, she had learned, made the losses that followed it far harder to bear, and she had lost enough in the past week to last a lifetime. Back in London, Julian stood in the empty rented room near Cheapside long after the landlady had returned to her own business. staring at the bare walls as though they might somehow reveal where Eleanor had gone. He returned to his townhouse that evening with nothing to show for his search, and found his mother waiting for him in the drawing room, her expression carrying the particular sharpness she reserved for conversations she considered overdue. "I have heard the rumors," the Dowager Duchess said without preamble. "A companion, dismissed from the Faircliff household under a cloud of scandal involving your name. Tell me it is not true." "It is true that I formed an attachment to a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. It is not true that anything improper occurred between us, whatever London has decided to believe." "It does not matter what actually occurred, Julian. It matters what is believed, and what is believed is that the Duke of Ashcombe nearly ruined himself over a penniless companion who has now vanished entirely, likely in disgrace. This is precisely the kind of scandal I have spent years trying to protect this family from." She rose from her chair, moving to stand directly before him. "You will let this matter rest. You will turn your attention to the ladies I have already identified as suitable matches, and you will allow this unfortunate episode to fade from memory as quickly as possible." "I cannot simply let it rest, Mother. She lost everything because of an attachment I encouraged. I owe her more than silence and convenient forgetting. You owe this family a duke who behaves with the dignity his position requires. Whatever affection you believe you feel for this woman, it cannot survive the reality of what marriage to her would mean, for you, for our name, for every advantage this family has built across generations. I will not stand by and watch you throw that away for a companion you have known scarcely a month." Julian said nothing further that evening, unwilling to argue a point his mother was in no state to hear, but her words followed him upstairs and sat with him long into the night. He did not doubt the difficulty of what he faced. A marriage to Eleanor, if it ever came to that, would indeed carry consequences far beyond his own preferences, consequences that would touch his family's standing, his mother's position in society, perhaps even matters of business and inheritance he did not yet fully understand. But he thought of Eleanor's face in that garden, the honesty in her voice when she told him he was simply a man standing in front of her, and he found he could not make himself care about consequences the way his mother wanted him to. He resolved, before sleep finally took him that night, that he would not abandon the search simply because his first attempt had failed. Somewhere in England, Eleanor Whitmore was building a new life without him, believing she had done the right thing by disappearing completely, and Julian intended to prove to her, however long it took, that she had been wrong to think he would simply let her go. A crash from the kitchen sent Eleanor running before she had even set down the mending in her lap, certain something terrible had happened to Margaret, who had grown frailer over the past month than Eleanor liked to admit. She found her mother's cousin on the floor beside an overturned stool, clutching her ankle and laughing weakly despite the obvious pain. "I am fine, truly. An old woman's foolishness, nothing more. I reached for the top shelf when I ought to have asked you first." Eleanor helped her into a chair and examined the ankle carefully, relieved to find it merely twisted rather than broken, though it would need rest for several days. As she wrapped a cool cloth around the swelling, she felt, not for the first time since arriving in Willowmere, a quiet sense of purpose she had not expected to find here. Margaret needed her, genuinely needed her, in a way that had nothing to do with fetching shawls or remembering appointments for someone who barely acknowledged her existence beyond her usefulness. 6 weeks had passed since her arrival, and Eleanor had settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its steadiness. She helped Margaret manage the small household, took on mending work for 2 other families in the village to earn a modest income of her own, and had even begun teaching letters to a handful of village children whose parents could not afford a proper tutor. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was honest, and it was hers, built without depending on anyone's charity or goodwill. She thought of Julian less often than she expected to, though never as rarely as she wished. Some evenings, sitting by the fire after Margaret had gone to bed, she allowed herself to remember the terrace, the garden, the alley behind the Faircliff townhouse where he had told her he intended to find a way through the impossible situation they faced. She wondered sometimes whether he had already forgotten her, whether his mother's list of suitable ladies had claimed his attention the way society expected it eventually would. She told herself it did not matter. She had built a life here that required nothing from him, and she intended to keep building it, brick by careful brick, until the memory of London faded into something distant and manageable. The village, however, had its own complications. A local farmer named Thomas Ellery, a widower of steady means and gentle manner, had taken a clear interest in Eleanor over the past fortnight, finding reasons to call at Margaret's cottage that had little to do with the small repairs he claimed to be checking on. Margaret encouraged the attention gently, believing a respectable match with a good man might offer Eleanor the security her circumstances currently lacked. "He is a kind man," Margaret said one evening, after Thomas had departed following an unnecessarily long conversation about a fence post that required no real discussion. And he does not know anything of London, or scandal, or dukes. He would offer you a peaceful life, Eleanor, and a peaceful life is not nothing. I know he is kind, Eleanor admitted. I simply do not feel for him what a woman ought to feel before considering marriage. Feelings can grow, given time and patience. Not every match begins with the kind of passion you are perhaps still holding on to from London. Eleanor did not answer that directly, though Margaret's words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She was not holding on to anything, she told herself. She had made her choice, had left London specifically to end whatever had existed between herself and Julian, and building a new life meant accepting that some doors, once closed, remained closed permanently. And yet, when Thomas Ellery visited again 3 days later, bringing a small basket of early-season vegetables and lingering longer than the visit required, Eleanor found herself distracted throughout the entire exchange, her mind wandering back to a garden in London and a man who had asked for nothing except the chance to know her. Meanwhile, in London, Julian's search had stalled entirely. Despite weeks of discreet inquiries sent to every contact he trusted, Eleanor had left no trail, no forwarding address, nothing that connected her disappearance to any specific destination. Edmund had suggested, gently, that perhaps she had intended exactly this, a complete severing of every thread that might lead Julian back to her, and that continuing to search might only prolong a pain better left to heal. She does not want to be found, Edmund said one evening, finding Julian once again poring over correspondence that led nowhere. Consider that possibility, Julian. She left deliberately, without word, precisely because she understood the situation better than either of us wished to admit. Perhaps the kindest thing you can do now is respect that choice. I have considered it, Julian said quietly. I have considered little else these past weeks, but I do not believe she left because she wanted to. I believe she left because she believed it was the only way to protect me from a scandal that would have followed us both. Those are not the same thing, and I will not abandon her simply because giving up would be easier. His mother's pressure, meanwhile, had only intensified. The Dowager Duchess had, without consulting Julian directly, begun arranging a formal courtship with Lady Priscilla Thornberry, going so far as to announce at a small family gathering that an engagement announcement might be expected before the season's end. Julian learned of this arrangement secondhand, through a relative who assumed he had already agreed to it, and confronted his mother that same evening with an anger he rarely allowed himself to show. You had no right to announce anything on my behalf, he said, standing in her drawing room with his composure barely intact. I have made no commitment to Lady Priscilla, nor do I intend to. You have made no commitment to anyone, which is precisely the problem, his mother replied, unmoved by his anger. You are the Duke of Ashcombe, Julian. You do not have the luxury of waiting indefinitely for feelings to resolve themselves while this family's future hangs in uncertainty. Lady Priscilla is an excellent match, her family's standing is impeccable, and she has made her willingness perfectly clear. I am simply ensuring you do not squander an opportunity while you chase after a woman who has already made her own choice to disappear. She did not choose to disappear because she wanted to leave me. She left because this family, and this society, made it impossible for her to stay. Then perhaps that should tell you something about the impossibility of what you are attempting, rather than driving you further into a pursuit that can only end badly for everyone involved, including her. Julian left his mother's drawing room that night with the argument unresolved, but with a growing clarity about the choice ahead of him. He could accept his mother's arrangement, marry Lady Priscilla, and allow the memory of Eleanor to fade into the kind of quiet regret most men of his position learn to live with. Or he could continue searching, risk his family's displeasure and society's judgment, and hope that somewhere in England, Eleanor Whitmore still wanted to be found. He thought of her honesty on that first terrace, her courage in speaking truth to a duke who had grown accustomed to flattery, and he knew, with a certainty that settled the argument entirely, which choice he intended to make. He simply did not yet know where to look next, or how much time he had before his mother's arrangements hardened into something no longer possible to undo. In Willowmere, that same uncertainty had begun pressing on Eleanor from an entirely different direction. Thomas Ellery called again the following week, and this time his intentions arrived without any pretense of fence posts or vegetable baskets. He found her alone in Margaret's small garden, pulling weeds from a bed of early herbs, and stood at the gate for a long moment before speaking. Miss Whitmore, I hope you will forgive my directness, but I am not a man skilled at hiding my intentions behind clever conversation. He turned his hat over in his hands, a habit Eleanor had noticed whenever he grew nervous. I have come to admire you a great deal these past weeks. You are patient with Margaret, kind to the children you teach, and you carry yourself with a dignity I do not often see in this village. I would like your permission to court you properly, with marriage as my honest intention, should you find yourself willing. Eleanor set down the small trowel in her hand and rose slowly, choosing her words with care. Thomas deserved honesty, not false encouragement built on gratitude for his kindness. Mr. Ellery, I am deeply grateful for your regard, and I do not say that merely to soften a refusal. You are a good man, and any woman would be fortunate to have your attention. But you do not feel the same, he finished for her, without bitterness, only quiet understanding. I do not believe I can. Not honestly. Not yet. There is a matter from my past I have not fully resolved within my own heart, and it would be unfair to you to accept a courtship while that remains unsettled. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this with the same steady patience he brought to everything else. London, then. Margaret has mentioned, in passing, that whatever brought you here weighs on you still. He paused, then added, more gently, I will not press you further, Miss Whitmore, but know that my offer will remain open. Should circumstances change, a man can be patient when the woman in question is worth the waiting. He left without further argument, and Eleanor stood alone in the garden long after he had gone, turning over the strange guilt of having disappointed a genuinely good man for the sake of a feeling she had no evidence would ever be returned. She had no letter from Julian, no word of any kind since her departure from London. For all she knew, he had already accepted his family's arrangements and moved forward exactly as society expected. And yet she could not make herself regret the answer she had given Thomas. Whatever remained unresolved in her heart, she owed it the honesty of not pretending it away simply because pretending would have been easier. Back in London, Edmund arrived at Julian's townhouse 3 days after their difficult conversation, carrying a piece of information he had gathered almost by accident while attending to unrelated family business. I spoke with a solicitor handling matters for several households in the Faircliff circle, he said, settling into the chair across from Julian without his usual ease. It seems Eleanor's mother had a cousin, a widow living somewhere in the countryside, mentioned briefly in old correspondence the solicitor happened to reference. I do not have a name or a location, only the knowledge that such a connection exists. Julian sat forward immediately, the first genuine hope he had felt in weeks sparking behind his eyes. Can the solicitor be persuaded to share more? Perhaps, with the right incentive and the right patience. I have already sent a request for further detail, though these things take time, and I would caution you against expecting an answer within days rather than weeks. Weeks may be more time than I have, Julian said quietly, thinking of his mother's growing insistence on the Thornbury match, of the engagement announcement she seemed determined to force into existence regardless of his own wishes. Then we will move as quickly as the information allows, Edmund said. But Julian, I must ask you plainly, if we find her, and if she has built some new life for herself in this countryside, are you prepared for the possibility that she may not wish to leave it? That she may have found some peace you would only disturb by appearing again? Julian considered the question seriously, turning it over rather than dismissing it out of pride or desperation. I am prepared for that possibility. But I am not prepared to make that choice for her by never asking at all. She deserves to decide for herself whether she wants what I am offering, and I owe her the chance to make that choice with full knowledge of how I feel, rather than assuming her silence means rejection. Edmund studied his friend for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied by the answer. Then let us hope the solicitor proves more forthcoming than his profession usually allows. The days that followed passed slowly for both of them, though in entirely different ways. In Willowmere, Eleanor returned to the quiet rhythm of her days, teaching the village children, mending Margaret's household linens, and trying without much success to stop wondering whether Julian had truly given up the search she had asked him, in her heart if not in words, never to abandon. In London, Julian waited for word from the solicitor while fending off his mother's mounting pressure, attending obligatory gatherings with Lady Priscilla where his distraction grew more obvious with each passing week, until even Lady Priscilla herself began to notice that his attention belonged somewhere entirely beyond the room they occupied together. The solicitor's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Julian tore it open standing in his own front hall before his coat had even been taken from his shoulders. The information was sparse but enough. A widow named Margaret Holloway, residing in a village called Willowmere, some 5 hours' ride from London, listed in old family correspondence as a cousin on the mother's side of the Whitmore family. No confirmation that Eleanor had actually gone there, only the possibility that she might have, the single thread of connection Julian had been searching for across nearly 2 months of silence. He called for his carriage within the hour, ignoring Edmund's suggestion that he wait until morning to travel with a clearer head and a proper plan. I have waited 2 months already, Julian said, pulling on his riding coat with hands that betrayed more urgency than he usually allowed himself to show. I do not intend to wait a single day longer than necessary. And what will you say to her, if you find her? You have had 2 months to consider this, Have you decided? Julian paused at the door, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I will tell her the truth, that I have not stopped thinking of her, that I have refused every arrangement my mother has attempted to force upon me, and that whatever life she has built for herself in this village, I am asking only for the chance to be part of it, if she will have me. And if she has already found happiness there, without you, then I will accept that, however difficult it proves, but I will not accept never having asked. He rode through the night, arriving in Willowmere as the first gray light of morning touched the rooftops of the small village. He found the local inn easily enough, and the innkeeper, an elderly man with little interest in the affairs of strangers, confirmed readily enough that a widow named Holloway kept a cottage at the far edge of the village, along the lane past the church. Julian's heart pounded as he walked the quiet lane, rehearsing words he had already rehearsed 100 times during the long ride from London, none of them feeling adequate to the moment he was about to face. He reached the cottage just as the village was beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, a rooster somewhere calling the morning into being, and he stood at the gate for a long moment before finding the courage to knock. Margaret Holloway answered the door herself, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to open suspicion the moment she took in Julian's fine coat and unmistakably aristocratic bearing. "Can I help you, sir?" "Forgive the early hour," Julian said, removing his hat. "I am searching for a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. I have reason to believe she may be residing here with you." Margaret's expression hardened immediately, protective in a way that told Julian everything he needed to know about how much Eleanor had come to mean to this woman in the short time since her arrival. "And who might you be, calling on a young woman at this hour, unannounced and uninvited?" "My name is Julian Ashcombe. I believe Eleanor may have mentioned me, if she has spoken of London at all since her arrival." The name landed visibly. Margaret's hand tightened on the doorframe, and for a moment Julian feared she might simply close it in his face without another word. Instead, she studied him for a long, searching moment, as though weighing something significant in her own mind. "She has mentioned no names," Margaret finally said. "But she has mentioned a duke, and the trouble that followed loving one. I confess I did not expect that duke to appear at my door before breakfast, looking as though he rode through the night to get here. I did ride through the night. I have been searching for her for nearly 2 months, since her dismissal from the Faircliff household. I did not know, until 3 days ago, that she might have come here." Margaret's expression softened slightly, though caution remained. "She is teaching the village children their letters this morning, down at the old schoolhouse near the green. I will not pretend to know what is right in this situation, Your Grace, but I will say this. She has built something honest here, something that asked nothing of anyone except her own effort. Whatever you intend, I hope you intend to respect that, whatever her answer to you turns out to be." "I intend nothing less," Julian said, and meant it fully. He found the schoolhouse easily enough, a small stone building with its door propped open to let in the morning air, and he stood outside for a moment, listening to Eleanor's voice carrying through the open door as she guided a handful of children through their letters with patience Julian had not fully appreciated, until he heard it in practice. It was a voice he recognized instantly, though it carried a warmth here he had not heard in London, unburdened by the careful caution she had always maintained around him. He waited until the lesson ended, and the children scattered toward home, and then he stepped into the doorway just as Eleanor turned to gather her materials, freezing entirely at the sight of him standing there. "Julian," his name left her mouth as barely more than a breath, disbelief written across every feature of her face. "I found you," he said simply, unable to manage anything more eloquent despite 2 months of rehearsal. "You should not have come." She set down the small stack of slates she had been holding, her hands trembling slightly. "I left precisely so that you would not have to face the consequences of continuing this. I left to protect you. I know why you left. I have known since the moment I found your empty room near Cheapside and understood, finally, exactly what my mother's household and Lady Constance's cruelty had cost you. But Eleanor, I did not ask you to protect me at the cost of your own happiness. I never wanted that, and I will not accept it now that I have finally found you again." "And what would you have me do instead?" Her voice carried real anguish now, months of carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Return to London, to face the same scandal, the same ruin, only worse this time because I will have come back after having disappeared once already. Your mother has already arranged your future with Lady Priscilla Thornberry. I have heard as much, even here. Gossip travels strangely far when it concerns a duke. My mother has arranged nothing with my consent. I have refused Lady Priscilla. I have refused every match presented to me these past 2 months, because I could not make myself pretend interest in any woman while you remained unfound. I am not here because my mother sent me, Eleanor. I am here because I could not continue living as though the woman I love simply vanished from the earth, without leaving some part of myself behind with her. The word love hung in the small schoolhouse between them, spoken plainly for the first time, and Eleanor felt something in her chest break open entirely, months of careful restraint finally giving way beneath the weight of hearing him say aloud what she had refused to fully admit she hoped for. I built a life here, she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier firmness. A small life, an honest one, built on nothing but my own effort. I have a place teaching these children. I have Margaret, who needs me. I have peace, Julian, real peace, for the first time since my parents died. I am not asking you to give up any of that. I am asking whether there is room, within the life you have built, for a man who has spent 2 months searching every corner of England to find you again. I am not offering you a return to London society, or a life spent hiding what you feel behind careful distance. I am offering whatever future we can build together, wherever that future needs to happen, whether that means you teaching these children for the rest of your days with me beside you, or something else entirely that we decide together. Eleanor stood very still, the schoolhouse quiet around them except for the soft sound of wind moving through the open door, and she found herself, for the first time in 2 months, allowing herself to imagine a future she had firmly forbidden herself from hoping for. Your family will never accept this, she said quietly, though the protest had lost most of its conviction. Society will never forgive it. My family will adjust, in time, or they will not, and I will bear that consequence gladly, if it means building a life with you, rather than a life of quiet regret, alongside someone I do not love. As for society, I have already learned these past 2 months precisely how little their opinion is worth weighing against genuine happiness. He crossed the small schoolhouse and took her hands in his, and Eleanor did not pull away. I am asking you plainly, Eleanor Whitmore, without titles or arrangements or anyone else's permission required, will you allow me to stay, to court you properly this time, openly, without secrecy or shame, regardless of what it costs either of us? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had ridden through the night, and stood before her now without any of the careful composure London demanded of dukes, and she felt the last of her careful resolve finally give way entirely. Yes, she said, though I warn you, Julian Ashcombe, that Willowmere offers nothing like the comforts you are accustomed to in London. Willowmere, he said, smiling for what felt like the first time in 2 months, offers exactly what I have been searching for since the moment I met you on that terrace. I do not require anything more than that. Word of the Duke's arrival spread through Willowmere within the day, as such things always did in small villages, and by evening even Thomas Ellery had heard the news, arriving at Margaret's cottage with quiet grace to offer his genuine well-wishes rather than any bitterness over an affection he had always suspected he could not compete with. I hope you find the happiness you deserve, Miss Whitmore, he said simply, before taking his leave for the final time, whatever shape that happiness takes. That evening, Julian took a room at the village inn rather than presume upon Margaret's hospitality, and Eleanor walked with him along the quiet lane after supper, the two of them speaking freely for the first time, without the constant fear of discovery that had shadowed every previous meeting in London. She told him, in full now, everything she had held back before, the debts her father had left behind, her mother's final illness, the years of careful invisibility she had built simply to survive. I understand now why you guarded yourself so carefully, Julian said, listening to all of it without judgment, only a quiet ache for what she had endured alone. I wish I had known sooner, so that I might have eased some part of that burden rather than adding to it. You did not add to it, not truly. Lady Constance and my own fear did that. You only offered something I had forgotten was possible, a person who saw me as more than simply useful. Eleanor paused beneath the shade of an old oak near the church, looking up at him with an openness she had never allowed herself in London. I am frightened, Julian. Not of you, but of what comes next. Your mother, London. Everything we will face if we truly attempt this. I am frightened too, he admitted. I have never in my life gone against my mother's wishes so completely, nor risked so much of what my family expects of me. But I have spent 2 months learning that the alternative, a life built on obligation rather than genuine feeling, frightens me far more. They spoke long into the evening of practical matters as well, the shape their future might take, whether Eleanor would return to London at all, or whether Julian might find some way to build a life that honored the peace she had found in Willowmere. Neither of them pretended the path ahead would be simple. Julian's mother would not accept the match easily, and society's judgment, however little either of them wished to weigh it, would follow them regardless of where they chose to live. I do not need Willowmere to remain exactly as it is, Eleanor said finally. I found peace here because I had nowhere else to go, not because this particular village holds some magic the rest of the world lacks. What I need is honesty and effort, and not being asked to hide what I feel simply to protect someone else's comfort. Then that is precisely what I intend to offer, wherever we ultimately decide to build our life together. Julian remained in Willowmere for 3 days, calling properly on Eleanor each afternoon under Margaret's watchful but increasingly approving eye, and by the third evening, Margaret herself pulled Julian aside with the particular bluntness of a woman who had outlived any patience for careful diplomacy. "I do not know what awaits you both in London," she said, "but I have watched that young woman carry a weight these 6 years that no person ought to carry alone. If you intend to ease that weight rather than add to it, you have my blessing, for whatever an old widow's blessing is worth to a duke. It is worth a great deal, Mrs. Holloway, more than you likely realize." On the morning of the 4th day, Julian prepared to return to London, though not before making Eleanor a promise he intended to keep, regardless of what obstacles awaited him there. "I am going back to face my mother directly, and to end whatever arrangement she has attempted with Lady Priscilla's family. I do not know how long it will take to settle matters properly, but I will send word the moment there is anything honest to report, and I will return the instant I am able. And if your mother refuses to accept this, no matter what you say to her, then I will choose you regardless, Eleanor. I have already decided that much. What remains uncertain is only how difficult the path will be, not whether I intend to walk it." She watched his carriage disappear down the lane leading out of Willowmere, and though fear and hope tangled together uncomfortably in her chest, she found herself, for the first time since her dismissal from the Faircliff household, genuinely uncertain which feeling would ultimately win. It was, she realized, an entirely different uncertainty than the despair she had carried these past 2 months, and she chose, deliberately, to let herself hold on to the hope instead. But the true test of Julian's resolve still waited for him in London, where his mother remained entirely unaware that her son had abandoned the search for a suitable bride, entirely in favor of the very companion she had forbidden him to pursue, and where Lady Priscilla Thornberry's family had already begun quiet preparations for an engagement announcement they fully expected to become official before the season's end. The Dowager Duchess's drawing room was already filled with guests when Julian arrived home, and he understood the moment he stepped through the door that his mother had not waited for his return before setting her plans firmly into motion. Lady Priscilla Thornberry stood near the fireplace in a gown clearly chosen for the occasion, her mother beside her wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who believed her daughter's future had already been secured. A small gathering of family friends filled the remaining space, and Julian understood, with a cold drop in his stomach, exactly what evening this had been arranged to become. "Julian," his mother said, crossing to greet him with a smile meant for the watching guests rather than for him. "You have returned just in time. I was beginning to fear you might miss the announcement entirely." "What announcement?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Your engagement to Lady Priscilla, of course. I have already spoken with her family, and given how long this courtship has quietly progressed, I saw no reason to delay matters further, particularly with your recent unexplained absence raising questions I would rather put to rest immediately." Julian felt the eyes of the room settle on him, waiting for the expected response, the grateful acceptance of an arrangement he had never actually consented to. He looked at Lady Priscilla directly, and saw in her expression something he had not fully appreciated before, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested even she understood this moment rested on assumptions rather than genuine agreement between them. "Mother, I must speak with you privately, before this goes any further. There is nothing to discuss privately that cannot be said before our guests. You have delayed long enough, Julian. It is time to honor what this family requires of you." He understood then that she intended to force the matter publicly, believing correctly that Julian would hesitate to embarrass her, or Lady Priscilla, or the assembled guests, by refusing outright in front of everyone. It was, he realized, precisely the kind of pressure his mother had used effectively for years, counting on his sense of duty to override whatever private objections he might raise. He chose, in that moment, not to let it work. "Then I will say plainly, before everyone present, that I have made no commitment to Lady Priscilla, and I do not intend to make one now." He turned to Lady Priscilla directly, softening his tone with genuine respect for a woman who deserved better than being used as a pawn in his mother's plans. "Lady Priscilla, you are a woman of considerable grace, and you deserve a husband who chooses you fully, with his whole heart. I am not that man, and I would be doing you a grave disservice to pretend otherwise simply to satisfy my mother's expectations tonight." A murmur moved through the assembled guests, scandal already forming behind polite, shocked expressions. Lady Priscilla's mother's face had gone pale with fury, and his own mother stood frozen, clearly unprepared for her son to refuse her so completely, so publicly, in front of the very people whose opinion she valued most. "Julian," his mother said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "you will retract that statement immediately, or you will humiliate this family beyond any hope of repair." "I will not retract it, because it is the truth, and I am done pretending otherwise for the sake of appearances." He drew a steadying breath, aware that everything he said next would determine far more than this single evening. "I love a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. I have loved her since a conversation on a terrace nearly 3 months ago, a conversation that had nothing to do with titles or fortune, or any of the calculations this family has taught me to value above genuine feeling. She was dismissed from her position and driven from London by rumor and cruelty that had far more to do with her lack of fortune than any actual wrongdoing on her part, and I intend to marry her, regardless of what this room or this family or all of society has to say about it." The room fell into complete silence, the kind of silence that Julian understood would be discussed in every drawing room across London by morning, regardless of how the evening ultimately concluded. His mother's expression cycled through fury, disbelief, and something that might have been genuine fear for what this admission would cost the family's standing. "You would throw away everything, your position, this family's reputation, for a companion with no fortune and no name worth mentioning?" "I would throw away nothing that actually matters," Julian said, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. "I would gain everything that does, a wife who loves me for exactly who I am, not for what my title provides her. A life built on honesty rather than obligation. I am sorry, Mother, that this is not the choice you wanted for me, but it is the choice I am making, tonight and for the rest of my life." Lady Priscilla, to Julian's genuine surprise, stepped forward before her own mother could speak, her expression carrying more understanding than anger. "I confess, Your Grace, I suspected for some weeks that your attention belonged elsewhere. I would rather know the truth now than build a marriage on a foundation that was never truly there. I wish you happiness, whatever form it takes." She turned to her own mother, whose face had gone rigid with humiliation. "Mother, let us not make this evening more difficult than it already is." The gathering dissolved shortly afterward, guests departing in a flurry of whispered speculation that Julian understood would reach every corner of London society within days. His mother remained in the drawing room long after the last guest had gone, standing near the cold fireplace with an expression Julian had rarely seen on her face, something closer to genuine hurt than simple anger. "You have humiliated me in front of everyone whose good opinion I have spent decades cultivating," she said quietly. "I know, and I am sorry for the pain this causes you, truly. But Mother, I cannot build my entire life around cultivating opinions that were never going to bring me happiness. I would rather face society's judgment honestly than live a comfortable lie for the rest of my days." His mother studied him for a long, silent moment, and something in her rigid posture seemed, gradually, to soften, though not entirely. "Tell me about her then. This Eleanor Whitmore who has convinced you to sacrifice everything I have tried to build for this family." Julian told her, plainly and without exaggeration, of the terrace conversation, of Eleanor's honesty and quiet dignity, of the 6 years she had spent surviving alone after losing her family to debt and illness, of the courage it had taken her to build a new life in Willowmere after losing everything in London, through no true fault of her own. He watched his mother's expression shift slowly as he spoke, the anger giving way gradually to something more contemplative. "You truly love her," she finally said, not quite a question. "More than I have loved anything or anyone in my life." The Dowager Duchess was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost most of its earlier sharpness. "I will not pretend to be pleased by this, Julian. The world we live in does not forgive dukes easily for choosing companions over ladies of standing, and you will face difficulties I cannot entirely shield you from, regardless of how much I might wish to. But I have watched you these past months, distracted and unhappy in ways I chose to ignore because acknowledging them would have complicated matters I preferred to keep simple. I will not stand in your way further. I cannot promise easy acceptance, but I will promise not to actively oppose you." It was not the full blessing Julian had hoped for, but it was far more than he had expected to receive that night, and he understood it represented genuine effort on his mother's part to bend, even slightly, towards something she had spent her whole life believing impossible. While Julian faced his mother's drawing room in London, Eleanor spent those same days in Willowmere, caught between hope and a dread she could not fully shake, no matter how she tried to occupy her hands and her mind with the ordinary business of teaching and mending. She continued her lessons with the village children each morning, though Margaret noticed her attention wandering more than usual, her eyes drifting toward the lane whenever a cart or carriage passed within sight of the cottage window. You will wear a groove in that floor if you keep pacing it every evening, Margaret said gently, on the second night after Julian's departure, finding Eleanor standing near the window long after supper had been cleared away. Come, sit with me. Worrying will not make the carriage arrive any sooner. I cannot help it. I keep imagining every possible way this could go wrong, his mother refusing entirely, society turning against him so completely that he comes to regret this choice, even if he does not say so aloud. I have built a peaceful life here, Margaret, and I fear how much I have already risked simply by allowing myself to hope for more. Margaret took her hand and held it firmly. You have risked exactly what every person risks who chooses to love honestly, rather than safely. There is no guarantee in it, Eleanor. Not for a duke and a companion. Not for a farmer and a widow's daughter. Not for anyone. But I have watched you these past months build a life from nothing, using only your own courage and effort. Whatever happens with the duke, you have already proven you do not require rescue. If he returns, it will be because he wants a partner, not because you need saving. That distinction matters more than you may currently realize. Eleanor found some comfort in those words, though the worry did not fully leave her until the afternoon she finally heard the sound of carriage wheels on the lane. 3 days after Julian's departure, exactly as he had promised, and she stood in the schoolhouse doorway with her heart pounding, watching him step down and walk toward her with an expression that told her, before he spoke a single word, that whatever had happened in London had ended in his favor. He returned to Willowmere 3 days later, his heart lighter than it had been in months, carrying news of everything that had transpired in his mother's drawing room. He found Eleanor in the schoolhouse once again, and this time, when she saw him standing in the doorway, she crossed the room to meet him without hesitation, without the careful distance that had once governed every interaction between them. It is done, he said, taking her hands in his. I have refused Lady Priscilla publicly, before my mother's entire gathering, and told everyone present exactly who I intend to marry. My mother has not fully accepted it, but she has agreed not to stand against us. And society? Eleanor asked, though the fear in her voice had softened considerably from the terror it once carried. They will not simply accept a duke marrying a dismissed companion. No, they will not easily, and perhaps not for some time. There will be gossip and difficulty and perhaps some doors that remain closed to us regardless of how this ultimately resolves. But Eleanor, I have learned these past months that the doors worth walking through are the ones that lead toward genuine happiness, not the ones that satisfy society's expectations of who a duke ought to marry. He knelt then, in the small schoolhouse where she had rebuilt her life from nothing, and asked her plainly, without the elaborate ceremony society usually demanded, whether she would consent to become his wife. Eleanor felt the weight of everything she had survived these past months, the dismissal, the cruelty, the fear of building a life alone with nothing but her own effort to depend on, and she understood, standing in that quiet schoolhouse with the man who had ridden through the night and faced his own family's fury to find her, that she was finally being offered something she had never truly believed possible. Not rescue, not charity, but genuine partnership, chosen freely by a man who valued her honesty above every advantage society could offer him instead. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. News of their engagement reached London within the week, and though the initial reaction carried exactly the scandal and disbelief Eleanor had feared, something unexpected followed close behind it. Lady Constance Fairclough, upon hearing that the companion she had dismissed without reference was to become the Duchess of Ashcombe, found her own reputation suddenly and uncomfortably scrutinized by the very society whose approval she had always valued above all else. Whispers questioning the cruelty of her original dismissal circulating with the same speed that had once destroyed Eleanor's own prospects. Lady Priscilla Thornbury, meanwhile, married a viscount of genuine affection within the year, having decided, after the drawing-room confrontation, that she preferred honest feeling to convenient arrangement in her own life as much as she had wished it for Julian. Eleanor and Julian married in a small ceremony the following spring, choosing a modest gathering over the grand society wedding his position might have demanded, with Margaret Holloway and Edmund Carow standing as witnesses to a match built on nothing more elaborate than honesty and genuine regard. The Dowager Duchess attended, her acceptance still imperfect but genuine in its effort, and even Thomas Ellery sent word of his sincere congratulations from Willowmere, wishing them both the happiness he had once hoped, briefly, to offer Eleanor himself. Every noble lady in London had wanted the Duke of Ashcombe for his title, his fortune, his position, at the very top of a society that measured worth by bloodlines and inheritance. In the end, he had chosen the one woman who had walked away from all of it, who had wanted nothing from him except the truth of who he actually was, and who had taught him, in turn, exactly what it meant to be seen fully, without the weight of a title standing between two people who had simply, honestly, fallen in love. In the years that followed, Eleanor never fully abandoned the quiet purpose she had discovered in Willowmere. She established a small school on the Ashcombe estate grounds, open to children of tenants and servants alike, teaching letters and simple arithmetic the same way she once had in that modest stone schoolhouse near the village green. Julian supported the venture without hesitation, understanding that this work had given Eleanor something no title or fortune ever could, a sense of purpose entirely her own, built from her own hands rather than inherited or granted by marriage. Society did not embrace them easily, exactly as Julian had warned her it would not. Certain drawing rooms remained closed to them for a season or two. Certain families made their disapproval known through careful, polite distance rather than open cruelty. But Eleanor found, gradually, that she cared far less about those closed doors than she once feared she might. She had survived worse than cold politeness. She had survived losing everything and rebuilding a life from nothing, and the quiet judgment of a few disapproving households could not touch the steadiness she had earned through that survival. The Dowager Duchess, true to her word, did not stand in their way, and over time her reserved acceptance warmed into something closer to genuine affection, particularly once she came to know Eleanor's steady character firsthand rather than through the distorted rumors that had once colored her opinion. She found, much to her own quiet surprise, that she admired the very qualities in her daughter-in-law that she had once dismissed as unsuitable: the practical resilience, the refusal to be intimidated by rank, the honest affection Eleanor carried for Julian that no calculated match could ever have produced. Lady Constance Faircliff's own fortunes, meanwhile, continued their quiet decline. Whispers of her cruelty toward a dismissed companion who had gone on to become a duchess followed her through every gathering she attended, and within 2 years she found herself, ironically, occupying much the same position in society's estimation that she had once forced upon Eleanor, tolerated rather than truly welcomed, her invitations growing steadily thinner as the seasons passed. Margaret Holloway visited the Ashcombe estate twice each year, her ankle long since healed, her pride in Eleanor's happiness evident in every letter she sent between visits. Thomas Ellery eventually married a widow from a neighboring village, a match built on genuine affection that Eleanor was glad, whenever news of it reached her, to know he had found. And on quiet evenings, when the demands of the estate and society had finally settled for the day, Julian and Eleanor often returned in conversation to that first meeting on the terrace, the moment a companion sent to fetch a fan had told a duke the plain truth about himself, and changed the entire shape of both their lives in the process. It remained, to both of them, proof of something Eleanor had come to believe deeply during her hardest months alone, that genuine worth was never truly measured by title or fortune, but by the courage to be honest, and the willingness to choose love, even when the whole world insisted it was impossible. 5 years into their marriage, a letter arrived at the Ashcombe estate that neither Julian nor Eleanor expected, and its contents pulled them both back, briefly, into a chapter of their story they had believed long settled. The letter came from a young woman named Alice Marrow, a former companion who had once served alongside Eleanor in a distant corner of London society, someone Eleanor remembered only faintly from a handful of shared gatherings years before her own dismissal from the Faircliff household. Alice wrote with careful, nervous formality, explaining that she had recently found herself dismissed from her own position under circumstances distressingly similar to Eleanor's, accused of improper attachment to a gentleman of standing, though in her case the accusation was entirely false, born of jealousy from another servant, rather than any real wrongdoing. She had heard, through servants' gossip that traveled surprisingly far across England, that the Duchess of Ashcombe had once been a dismissed companion herself, risen from nothing through courage and honest love, and she wondered, with evident embarrassment at her own boldness, whether the Duchess might have any guidance for a woman facing a similar ruin with nowhere left to turn. Eleanor read the letter twice at the breakfast table, her chest tightening with memories of her own desperate weeks searching for a position that never came, the doors closed politely in her face, the reputation destroyed by rumor she had no power to correct. She passed the letter to Julian without a word, watching his expression shift as he read it himself. "We must help her," Eleanor said simply, once he had finished. "I agree entirely. What did you have in mind?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, drawing on everything she had learned since her own ruin and recovery. A position first, somewhere safe, away from whatever household destroyed her reputation, and beyond that, perhaps something more lasting. I have often thought, these past years, how differently my own situation might have unfolded if I had known even one other woman who understood exactly what I was facing, rather than facing it entirely alone. Within the month, Alice Marrow arrived at the Ashcombe estate, initially to assist Eleanor with the growing school she had established for tenant and servant children, though the arrangement quickly became something more significant than simple employment. Eleanor found herself, almost without deciding to, becoming a genuine mentor to the younger woman, sharing not just practical guidance about navigating a precarious position, but the harder wisdom of surviving public ruin without losing one's sense of self in the process. "You will hear whispers," Eleanor told her, during one of their early conversations in the small estate schoolroom. "Some will call you fortunate to have found refuge here, as though your worth depends entirely on the charity of others. Do not let that shape how you see yourself. You survived a false accusation and a cruel dismissal with your character entirely intact. That is not luck, that is strength, and no amount of society's whispering changes what you actually are." Alice's situation, once fully investigated, revealed a deeper injustice than either Eleanor or Julian had initially suspected. The gentleman she had been falsely accused of pursuing had in fact been pursuing her without invitation, his attentions unwanted and increasingly persistent, and the jealous servant who spread the original rumor had done so at his quiet encouragement, hoping to force Alice into a dependent position, where she would have no choice but to accept whatever arrangement he eventually proposed. Julian, upon learning the full truth, used his own standing within society to ensure the matter reached exactly the right ears, quietly but effectively ruining the gentleman's reputation among the very circles that had once welcomed him without question. It was not vengeance exactly, Julian reasoned, simply the correction of an injustice that Eleanor herself had once suffered without any similar recourse. "I could not undo what happened to you," he told Eleanor one evening, after the matter with Alice's former employer had been quietly settled. "I could not go back and prevent Lady Constance from dismissing you, or prevent society from believing the worst, simply because you had no fortune to protect you. But I find some comfort in being able to prevent it from happening again to someone else, even if it does not erase what you endured yourself." "You give yourself too little credit," Eleanor said, taking his hand. "You did more than prevent one injustice, Julian. You showed an entire household of servants and companions that a duke's power could be used to protect the vulnerable, rather than simply reward the privileged. That matters more than you may realize." Alice remained at the Ashcombe estate for nearly 2 years before eventually marrying a respectable young solicitor she met through the estate's growing circle of acquaintances, a man who valued her intelligence and resilience precisely because Eleanor had taught her, through patient example, that those qualities were worth more than any fortune or family name. She wrote to Eleanor faithfully for years afterward, her letters filled with genuine gratitude for a kindness extended at precisely the moment she had needed it most. News of Eleanor's quiet efforts to help women in similarly precarious positions spread slowly through certain circles of London society, transforming, over time, into something of a reputation entirely separate from the scandal that had once defined her name. Where she had once been whispered about as the companion who nearly ruined a duke, she became known instead, gradually and deservedly, as a woman who used her unexpected position to extend genuine protection to those without power or standing of their own. The Dowager Duchess, observing this transformation with the same careful attention she brought to everything involving the family's reputation, found herself surprised by her own growing pride in a daughter-in-law she had once considered an unfortunate complication to be managed rather than embraced. "I confess," she told Julian one evening, some years into the marriage she had once opposed so fiercely, "I did not expect to be grateful for your stubbornness in pursuing her. I feared scandal and ruin. I did not anticipate that Eleanor would become one of the finest influences this family has known in generations." "She has always been that," Julian said simply. "I merely had the good fortune to recognize it before the rest of society caught up." Eleanor, for her part, never forgot the woman she had been before Willowmere, the companion who fetched shawls and remembered appointments and made herself as small and invisible as survival required. She kept that memory close, not with bitterness, but as a reminder of exactly why her work mattered, why every young woman she helped find safe passage through similar ruin represented something worth far more to her than any grand estate or title ever could. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Julian and Eleanor walked together through the gardens of the Ashcombe estate, much as they had once walked through the Hollingsworth garden in careful secrecy so many years before, though now with nothing to hide and no one left to please except each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Julian asked, only half seriously. "The scandal, the difficulty, everything society put you through before we finally found our way to this?" Eleanor considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything, before answering. "I regret the cruelty. I regret Lady Constance's dismissal, and the months of fear that followed it, and every door that closed in my face simply because I had no fortune to soften society's judgment. But I do not regret the path itself, Julian, because it led me here, to a life built on honesty rather than obligation, and to a purpose I would never have found had everything simply gone easily from the start. Then I am glad, selfishly, that the path was difficult, Julian said, because it led us both to exactly where we were always meant to be. Their eldest daughter, Grace, now 7 years old, ran ahead of them along the garden path, chasing a small dog that had been a gift from Edmund the previous winter, and Eleanor watched her with the quiet satisfaction of a mother who intended her children to grow up understanding exactly the values that had shaped their parents' own difficult path toward one another. Grace asked me last week why some of the older ladies at church speak to me so carefully, as though choosing their words with great caution, Eleanor said, watching her daughter's laughter carry across the evening air. I told her the truth, that some people believe a person's worth depends on where they began in life, rather than who they choose to become. I do not know if she fully understood it yet, but I want her to grow up knowing the story plainly, without shame attached to any part of it. What will you tell her, when she is old enough to understand it fully? Everything. That her mother was once a companion with nothing but a trunk of belongings and a dismissal that nearly destroyed her. That her father rode through the night to find a woman society told him he had no business loving. That the two of us built this life together, deliberately, against every expectation placed upon us, because we decided honest happiness mattered more than convenient obedience to rules that never served either of us fairly. Julian watched his daughter continue her chase through the garden, laughter carrying clear and unguarded in a way that Eleanor herself had rarely been permitted during her own childhood, and he felt, not for the first time, a deep gratitude for everything that had led them to this particular evening, this particular garden, this particular family built from choices rather than obligation. Edmund visited often in those years, his own bachelor life eventually giving way to a quiet, contented marriage of his own, to a widow he met through the Ashcombe estate's expanding circle of acquaintances, and he never tired of reminding Julian, with the same blunt honesty he had always offered, exactly how close his friend had once come to abandoning the search entirely out of fear for the consequences. "You very nearly let caution win," Edmund said one evening, watching Julian and Eleanor together across the drawing room with genuine fondness. "I have never been more relieved to be wrong about anything in my life." "You were never entirely wrong," Julian admitted. "The consequences were real. Society did judge us harshly for a time, and my mother's disapproval cost me something I have never fully recovered, even now. But you underestimated how much more difficult the alternative would have been, living a comfortable, obligated life, while wondering forever what might have happened had I simply found the courage to ask." Eleanor, listening to this exchange with quiet amusement, added her own observation without hesitation. "And you underestimated me as well, Edmund. If you believed a duke's fear of consequence would have stopped me from building some life worth living, with or without him, I had already proven that much to myself, alone in Willowmere, long before he found his way back to me." The conversation dissolved into easy laughter, the kind shared freely among people who had weathered genuine difficulty together, and emerged with their affection for one another entirely intact. And as the evening settled into comfortable quiet, Eleanor found herself thinking, as she often did, of the terrified young woman who had once hidden behind a curtain at a ballroom, certain that invisibility was the only safety available to a woman with nothing to her name. That woman had survived, had rebuilt herself from ruin twice over, and had finally found not just safety, but genuine belonging, proof that the courage to be seen, however frightening it first appeared, was worth every risk it demanded along the way. They walked on together through the quiet garden, past roses that had long since bloomed into fullness, two people who had once been separated by every rule society could construct, and who had found, in the end, that the truest measure of worth had never rested in titles or fortune at all, but in the simple, stubborn courage to choose honest love over easy convenience, regardless of what the world demanded instead.